Welcome to Cloudbreak, where breakthrough innovation meets breakthrough growth. Today, Yuval Neiman of Trilogy Equity Partners chats with Gideon Mendels, CEO and co-founder of Comet. Comet provides an end-to-end platform for managing the entire ML and LLM lifecycle from training to production with best-in-class evaluations, experiment tracking, and product monitoring. Here's their conversation.
Hey, Gideon, thanks for joining us for our series with Trilogy founders, Cloudbreak. I've been privileged to be part of your journey and a witness to it for the last 7 or 8 years or so. But now we'd like to share it with a bunch of other, founders and so forth. And so let's start at the beginning. Introduce yourself and how did you start?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me. I'm Gideon Mendels. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Comet. We started a company in early 2018 or so, and essentially we're an end-to-end AI observability platform. So we kind of have two sides. One side is for companies and teams building their own machine learning models. And we provide tools around dataset versioning, experiment tracking, model registry, model monitoring. And then more recently, in the last couple of years or so, obviously there's a huge shift towards Gen AI, and we recently launched Opik, which is our product focus on teams building on top of LLMs versus training the models from scratch. So yeah, that's in a nutshell. But happy to dive in and tell you more about Comet. I think you asked about the origin story. So personally, my background, I started my career as a software engineer. I think it's been 16, 17 years ago. And then I shifted to working on machine learning about 10, 11 years ago. And at first I was a grad student and I actually worked on language models, which at the time were considered the boring part of speech recognition systems. It's crazy, right? And then I joined Google and I also worked on language models there. It's specifically hate speech detection for YouTube comments. This is right before the Transformer days. I'm dating myself, but these were LSTM models. That's kind of like, how I got into this world of machine learning. And one of the things that were pretty eye-opening was, especially when you're coming from a software engineering background where, we have this amazing set of tools, databases, testing, monitoring, version control, IDEs, right? But then you join a machine learning team, and at least back then, it was like the complete Wild West, right? Like at Google, for example, everything was kind of managed in Google Docs and emails, and there was no history of what experiments they've attempted. There was no actually knowledge exactly what's running in production, what data set it was trained on. And if anyone remembers what the YouTube comment section looked like back in 2016, it was pretty obvious our models weren't performing very well. I think one person called it the worst place on the internet. And it's funny because it's actually not objectively hard machine learning problem. And we had all the data in the world. We had smart people, we had compute, we had everything we needed to succeed, but the whole thing was managed basically like a school project. So I called up Nimrod, who's our CTO and co-founder, and I worked with him previously on machine learning. And I was like, hey, remember you're making fun of my workflow and how everything is stitched together. And so I'm at Google and it's exactly the same thing, but now we're at scale and it it breaks and it's much more painful. So that's really how we got started working on this, because it was an obvious problem and really we were trying to solve our own pain point. We didn't have to kind of ask around. This is stuff we felt personally when we were trying to train and deploy machine learning models. So again, that's kind of in a nutshell, but happy to share more details.
That's great. And obviously, we're not going to cover the entirety of everything that happened in those 7, 8 years, but I can at least recall from my vantage point, on the board, two kind of key things that shaped the company. One was around the pandemic, when the pandemic hit, and the other one obviously is kind of the decision around Opik and what to do with AI, kind of when the LLM world kind of started appearing. So maybe take them one at a time and tell a little bit of story and kind of your experience as a founder and CEO of a company needing to, make some difficult decisions potentially.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously pandemic was very hard for a lot of people, and running a company throughout that time was quite turbulent. But yeah, I mean, when we started, our focus was mainly individuals, right? And we got a lot of traction there. And then throughout the years, towards kind of like the latter part of 2019, early 2020, we started seeing more and more enterprise traction and kind of naturally started to evolve to an organization that cares a lot more about sales and numbers and so on. We kind of were building towards our Series A at that time. I remember what was it, like March 2020, when kind of everything started to fall apart. Obviously, putting aside all the horrible things that happen in the world and all the general challenges that anyone who lived through this, but it was a scary time because essentially, like many other companies, everything just shut down, right? Like any kind of deal we were working on went completely cold. No one was buying anything, and everyone's kind of trying to figure out what will happen. And so, it was very challenging.
You're about to raise your A round or getting into partner meetings, right?
We were probably, I would say, a week away from a term sheet for a Series A, maybe 2 weeks away from a term sheet for a Series A. Obviously, that completely, went cold. And so we had to figure out, okay, like, how do we keep running the business? We had a team that worked in person from our office in New York. So we had to kind of navigate through all of this pretty quickly. That was like 3 or 4 months that I wasn't very sure will be around for much longer.
I'd talk about kind of the decision to start Opik and what led to it, and how the company reacted as, experimental management continued to be an important piece, but this whole new world exploded and the priorities for a lot of your customers shifted.
Yeah, definitely. Starting like, let's say 2019 till mid 2023 or early 2024, we kind of expanded the MLOps platform. We started with experiment tracking, and then we grew it to essentially, end to end, anything, a team or a company needs there. And then ChatGPT came out, and obviously there was like a lot of excitement. And we started hearing from a bunch of our customers things like, hey, like we have a new problem we're solving, a new use case, but we're not going to train a model for it. We're just going to kind of consume a, LLM commercial API event to do so. And it's kind of like experiment tracking because we're still running experiments and trying all these different things, but it's also, we need to look at prompts and traces and all these different things. And they were kind of coming to us as their kind of partner, asking for help on how they could do that with the product. And at first, we just built some of that functionality into the kind of core platform, but then it just became very clear that the majority of what used to be ML use cases will now be based on LLMs, right? At least the way I think about it, if you think of the spectrum of ML use cases, on one end, you got the traditional tabular models, the logistic regressions, XGBoost. We power some of the biggest banks in the world. I can't name all of them, but like, for example, NatWest and Standard Bank and Monzo. And so they're like, obviously there's a big chunk of them in financial service, but essentially every company has them, right? Like, if you look at customer retention forecasting, revenue forecasting, all of those use cases. So they're very common. They're everywhere. So I'd say that's kind of like one end of the spectrum. On the complete other side of the spectrum, you got like the foundational model builders, and then like the self-driving cars, and we power a lot of them too, right? Like, Mobileye and Zoox and AI2 Stability, a lot of these like very heavyweight model training teams. But everything that's in between those two sides on that spectrum, I believe, will be replaced with, LLM API calls. There's still a lot of work to be done on top of it. It's not for free, but we're starting to see a lot of use cases. Like, we have customers training models for, image captioning. Like if you're in e-commerce, we power Shopify, Etsy, Zappos, all these guys. Like, but some of them like train computer vision models for image captioning. Like, you don't need to do that anymore. You can just call an LLM, right? So it started to become clear that that's the trend. We wanted to support our customer. We wanted to make sure that we can still add value in these things. So like I said, we first built some functionality into the core platform, but eventually September 2024, we launched Opik, which is really focused on these use cases. It's also end-to-end within that world. So the development of these things, how do you deploy them, and then eventually how do you observe and improve them in production. It's available as part of the Comet platform, but it's also available as an open source standalone solution. And it's actually been kind of exploding. It's the fastest growing project in that space in the last year or so.
That's fantastic. Can you talk about the decision to make Opik open source? The experiment management product is not open source, and you made a decision to create Opik as an open source project. You also have a commercial product alongside it, but talk about that. What led you to make that decision? You and the team, obviously.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So if I look at that shift from, call it, model building to building on top of LLM, one of the other things that happen is we're now seeing like a lot more software engineers. Like the majority of the people building this stuff is now software engineers. Now that matters for two reasons. Directly to the kind of open source questions, but the process of getting a Gen AI application working, you can get a POC up and running in a day or two, right? It's very easy, but actually getting it to work well is really hard. And the skills and the process and the methodology to do that is much more closer to the ML world than it is to software engineering, right?
Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, definitely. In software engineering, we write a piece of software, some logic, and then we write tests to it, and we can try to come up, with a pretty good coverage of all the different edge cases. And we write our unit test, and then we have pretty high certainty that our code works, right? But in the Gen AI world, like in most use cases, there's too many degrees of freedom, right? Like there's just no way you'll be able to cover everything or think of everything. So you need to find a way to get confidence in what you built worked. But it's not using unit tests because there's just no way, both from a technical perspective, like you can't compare two outputs of an LLM character by character and assume it will be the same. You kind of have to compare them semantically. Do they mean the same? But also the process is much closer to what it looks like in machine learning. And machine learning or data science, like generally speaking, we have some sort of a data set. When we make a change, we test it against that data set. So it tells us how well we're doing. Now that data set is a living, breathing thing. We have to add more examples to it. We have to change it. There's a lot of complexities on how you make that comparison, of course, but it's much similar to ML. Now, we've had, at that point, 6-7 years of experience doing this in ML. And back to your question on open source, like if your goal, and that was ours, is to really like set the standard on how the industry does something, right? How do people successfully build Gen AI application? It's, in my opinion, borderline impossible to do it as a proprietary solution, right? There's a good reason that, in dev tools, 9 out of 10 times the category winner is open source. And then, of course, we wanted to give back to the community. We've used a lot of open source here. It's not our first open source project, but the kind of like the first, company focused one. And we thought that by doing this, not only that we can give back to the community, but we can also get a lot back and learn how do people do this. This space is moving so fast, and getting that constant input from the community and like what they're seeing, how they're building things is very, very beneficial to kind of shape the product in the long term.
Got it. And so you launched Opik as an open source project about 7 months ago or 8 months ago, right?
Yeah.
7,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's getting some incredible traction. Can you share some of that with the listeners?
Yeah, definitely. It's the fastest growing kind of agentic evaluation product in the space. We did like 0 to 12,500 stars in about 8-9 months, and we're seeing almost every company you can imagine. Someone there deployed Opik. Sometimes it's just an individual contributor using it for their own needs. Sometimes it's like the internal platform team embedding it, and we're getting all these pull requests for all these contributors, all these commits. So it's been growing extremely fast. We also have a hosted version, which is also free. I actually have to run the numbers again, but we're on track for like something like 20 to 22x signups this year. So it's just been exploding. It's been really awesome to be part of it.
So we've mentioned Opik a bunch of time and who the users are. Can you just take a minute and describe the various aspects? What does Opik do, and how do people use it?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, like I said, Opik is open source and free. And all the functionality that's available in the commercial solution is also available in the open source solution. It's not like a fake freemium or anything like that. We care very much about it. And so it's very easy to get started. But essentially, it focuses on development and production. So in development, if you're building a Gen AI application, a chatbot, an agent, or really anything else, you just copy paste 2 lines of code into your existing code. And essentially what you're able to see right out of the gate is kind of full observability of what's happening in your application. So if a user asks a question and there's multiple steps in the process of getting them an answer, you might go to a database, pull some embeddings, compare them, find the top 10, make an LLM call, another LLM call. So you kind of get that full observability. So you're not only looking at a question and an answer, you actually see all the steps very easily in the UI. And that's critical from debugging perspective, because often something would break and you really want to easily know what is it that breaking. So that you'll get immediately out of the box. And then essentially we make it super easy to create that benchmark data set. So the idea is, again, we recommend people, like, you can, even with 10 or 15 examples, you can get so much more performance, right? So we make it very easy. Let's say while you interacted with your chatbot, you found some failures, you found some things that work well, you can, in a click of a button, add them to that benchmark data set. And then this is where, like, the really, really cool part comes in. Because now when you change something in your system prompt, okay, you're trying to make it better, or you change something in your vector database, you can, in a click of a button, rerun through all these examples in your benchmark data set and know, did I actually do better or worse? Because if you're manually trying to address one question that they got wrong, you could be breaking 10 others. So we make it really easy to run these evaluations. We provide many, many different metrics to know how well you're doing against that benchmark data set. It's not trivial to do that. So that's really, in its kind of basic way, on the development side. Now, once you made it to production, and production could be even like a limited set of users, doesn't have to be a full rollout, you'll get full observability of everything that's happening. Who's asking what are they asking, where is it failing, and inclusive of what we call online evaluation. So we can actually test some of these questions and answers automatically for you with a technique called LLM as a judge, which essentially there's a third LLM or a second LLM that's looking at the inputs and outputs and can score them. And it could be scored on the things you care about. You want to minimize hallucination. You want to make sure your chatbot is, upbeat and supportive to your users. You want to make sure your chatbot is concise versus verbose. You can define all these things you care about from a product or a business perspective, and Opik will automatically benchmark it for you. And then again, back to that benchmark data set. You look at the samples that your system didn't do well on, you add them back to that benchmark data set, and then you go back to development, make more changes, and improve it. If anyone takes one thing from this kind of conversation, is like, this is the flywheel that distinguish between Gen AI applications that will never make it to production to those that are winning in production. You have to make sure that you're constantly adding things to that data set, testing against it every time you make a change. That's really, I've seen hundreds of companies and what they built. If by far, that is the main thing that differentiates the one that succeeded and the ones that are still trying.
We typically invest in early stage, companies at seed stage. And one of the key things we're looking at for these, Gen AI based companies is, do they have a flywheel? As the more customers, the more users, the more usage they have, the more they create this unique proprietary data set, which is, what works, what doesn't work, and then feed that into their training. So that makes total sense. I know there's a lot of talk also about evaluation, so that I can switch. OpenAI just came up with GPT-5, and maybe I was using GPT-4, or maybe I was using Claude Sonnet or whatever, right? So first of all, I assume this is critical. Do you see customers actually switching between models frequently, or folks want to have the freedom to feel that they can do it, but maybe they don't do it as much? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so I don't see customers switch that often between vendors. I mean, typically, if someone goes with Anthropic or OpenAI, very often they stick around with them. I think some people have this notion that every time there's a new model out, everyone switches to it. And maybe on the consumer level, it might be true to an extent, but most of these like larger companies don't do that. That said, customers definitely try the different or the newer models from the providers. And this is where this benchmark data set is so powerful, because if, ChatGPT 5 does better on kind of public benchmarks, it doesn't necessarily mean it will do better on your application. And when you have that benchmark data set, you can easily make that switch and actually see within probably like a few minutes, is it doing better or worse? Now, if it's doing worse, it doesn't mean you should never switch. It probably should mean you need to like continue to iterate and try to see if you can find a better prompt. But it just gives you the flexibility to very quickly test things. When I talk to software engineers, I tell them, like, not doing this is like writing code without unit tests. Like, Is it working? Maybe. You never be sure.
You talked about Opik and some of the aspect, kind of the tracing and observability, and then also evaluation. You're also adding some key features, some key capabilities around deployment and being in production. Can you talk about that?
Yeah.
And how important do you see this having kind of end to end the whole life cycle of a let's call it Gen AI application, agent, whatever the term du jour is?
When I think about Opik, there's like, like the first two layers. The first one is traceability and observability, being able to see what's going on, right? Like that's the basics, everyone needs it. On top of it, you add evaluations, right? So I know how well I'm doing, not just the ability to dig through something and see if it's, breaking or not. But the third point, which is this like automatic optimization in production, is to me like the most interesting things in this space. And you talked a little bit about that flywheel. It's kind of crazy to think in one fundamental way. When we switched from like ML to Gen AI, we actually went backwards. 95% of the, call it traditional ML use cases that we power today with customers, these models get retrained every week, every month, every quarter, depending on the customer, right? So the idea is you get more data. Sometimes you need to label it, sometimes you don't, but like you get more data, you retrain, right? And then your model gets better. You avoid things like drift because the world's changing and so on. But when you think about Gen AI applications, sure, like OpenAI will drop a new model every quarter, but in its basic form, if you put a agentic application in production and you're using, let's say, OpenAI or Anthropic, it doesn't matter if you got one interaction in production or a billion, like your system will not get better. Like there's no mechanism to make it better other than that manual, tuning that the users are doing that, we obviously support. So when I think about it, it's a huge like step back, right? Because that's like really what makes ML successful. Like if all of my customers could only deploy once, like none of them or most of them wouldn't be successful. And in many ML use cases, you see what's called completely online models. Like when you scroll Instagram or TikTok and you like a video, within 2 videos, you start seeing more, it will recommend similar videos. Like it's completely online. But in these like Gen AI agentic applications, it's static, right? This is something we spent a lot of time on, and we've actually released about, I think 3 or 4 months ago, also completely open source, our agent optimization framework. And the idea there is if you have a data set of what good looks like, right, that benchmark data set, and you have a metric to test against it, which we provide through Opik, like, why can't we automatically change and improve the system prompt to get the best result? It's an optimization problem, right? So we actually shipped something which is using kind of reinforcement learning techniques. And what it will do, it will iterate on the prompt for you. It will literally change the system prompt by using an LLM, of course, and trying different things to get that best result on the benchmark data set. And the vision there is like eventually is if you have an agentic system in production or a Gen AI system in production, then you can run an optimization loop every week, every month, every quarter, similar to retraining, and get a much, much better performing system. That's a lot of what we're spending time on. And I'm personally very excited. This is the best part of this space is that like there's so many problems to solve, right? Like we're just getting started. So yeah, it's been a fun ride.
Very cool. Very cool. So switching gear a little bit, as you switch from a closed source proprietary product, EM, experiment management to Opik, which is all about building agentic systems. Talk about the changes or how you leverage kind of the go-to-market. So you had a traditional B2B SaaS go-to-market for your first product, and your second product now is this crazy open source. You get thousands of people downloading it every week, or I don't know, whatever. And then what does the go-to-market look like? And is it the same team that was doing it in the other one is now doing this?
Yeah. So it's a good point, right? I think prior to launching Opik and being a proprietary solution, our kind of go-to-market approach was very kind of bottoms up, kind of developer first, right? Like we have customers and users in a platform that are actually not technical at all, but like our focus was on these like technical people. So we were never like a top-down, kind of knock on a CTO door and say, "Hey, buy our software; it's the best thing ever." Like we that's never has been our approach. We did attempt it a few times, but like we realized like that's the wrong way to go about it. So from that perspective, yes, there's a lot of differences.
So you had a free product. People could just go sign up and start using the experiment management product. So in that sense, it was a little bit similar to the downloading of the open source.
Yeah, we have, about 100,000 plus engineers on like the MLOps, product. So we've had a lot of experience on that front as well. But there are some differences, right? Like, so first of all, like the biggest challenge with open source is you just have no idea who's using it and what they're doing with it, right? Like, and look, there's open source projects that try to kind of game it and add, BI calls inside the code, but like my perspective, it really goes against the spirit of open source. So we don't do any of that stuff. So you don't know who's using it. Sometimes you see a pull request or an issue open or a question on Slack, but like generally speaking, you don't know who's using it. And so that's kind of like a big challenge. But from a kind of marketing perspective, like yes, it's predominantly the same team. Obviously it evolved over the years. Some of the programs we did back then, we still do. Some of them changed. Like, I think we do a lot more hackathons today than maybe we did before. And, we obviously do a lot more in like contributing to other open source, taking contributions and so on. So there are some differences, but it wasn't like a 180 DNA shift for the company or anything like that.
Got it. And I know that, you've talked about how typically in open source, the first maybe year or two, companies spend just on adoption of the open source model and start investing in monetization only a year or two into it. You've had this kind of hybrid model a little bit. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at some of the, let's call it the most successful open source companies, Elastic, Mongo, Databricks, Grafana, the majority of them didn't have meaningful revenue traction in the first year or two, right? And that's because they focused on the open source and the adoption and the community. If you've kind of pushed for monetization very, very early, it contradicts what you're trying to do on the community side, right? Like eventually you want to find that balance. But even today, some of these very successful companies, like, I've heard numbers that only 3% of the open source kind of users actually pay money, right? So for us, like things were a little bit different because we already had like a big kind of commercial presence, powering some of the best AI teams in the world for many years. So when they heard we launched Opik, they were all like, hey, like, how do we get access? We wanted to, right? So it was a little bit easier from that perspective because they were already existing customers. They wanted to pay for it and are paying for it. So we are somehow in this hybrid approach, but from our investment, like where we're putting our hours, where we're putting our budget, like it's like 95% around community today.
Got it. Well, and I think, right, there's another difference between what you're doing and those companies you mentioned is this AI wave is moving so much faster than any of the other technologies or companies you'd mentioned before. The adoption is just growing so fast that there's probably it's probably going to behave a little different.
Yeah, absolutely. And because it's moving so fast, we're here talking about agents, and I'm sure if we did this podcast, I don't know, 12 months from now, we would be talking about something else within the Gen AI world. Because this space is moving so fast, like it just reiterates how important it is to like for us to build and for companies to adopt open source. It doesn't make sense that any commercial vendor or proprietary vendor, no matter how good they are, how well funded they are, will be able to kind of, catch up and be on top of things. And, with Opik, we're just seeing all these contributions, all these people asking questions and kind of building a product together as a community. So it's been really awesome. Everything we ship today is like community driven. Sometimes obviously the community build it and just, we merge the pull request. Sometimes they kind of bring that up. We have conversation and we build it ourselves, but it's all community driven.
Great. That's fantastic. So switching gears slightly,
Sure.
you have a unique vantage, viewpoint on what is really happening with all this agentic AI and kind of, I think that the thing I hear and everybody else, oh my God, it's so easy to do vibe coding and create a prototype that does amazing things in like 3 hours or less, but it's not ready for deploying either within an individual enterprise who's building it for internal use or definitely as an application. There's so many, A, it's not consistent. It hasn't been tested across many users. And B, there's issues with the data. Is there security around the data and privacy around the data where it needs to be? And on and on and on. Can you share what's your gut and kind of where we are today, and like where do you expect things to be 12 months from now? And yeah, granted, we both know that things are changing in a way that's hard to predict, but put in your prediction hat for a minute. So where are we today with deploying enterprise apps, Gen AI based agentic apps, and then maybe what are some of the key impediments for deploying them, and then where do you think we'll be in 12 months after everybody's using Opik?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think if let's talk about like enterprises, right? As an example of maybe like a segment that typically takes a little bit longer to kind of adopt things. There's a few use cases that they're very clear. Like first of all, like not a huge surprise, like they're all using, for their individual contributors provide like a form of chat GPT, right? So that's everywhere. The second use case that we're seeing everywhere is like call it coding assistant, right? Like the
Hmm.
cursor, the GitHub Copilot and, Windsurf and so on. So everyone's using that, like just different levels of adoption. And it typically tends to be more impacted by like the individual developers and like their appetite to use something like that. But that's kind of like everywhere.
Hey, can I just ask a question about that
Yeah.
category? Just a thought as I'm listening to you. I mean, in a way, OPIC is a little bit an extension of that category, right? Especially when you start doing the prompt optimization and the ongoing optimization. And as you were saying, that more and more software developers, not data scientists, machine learning people, are building those agentic apps, but it's software developers. You're kind of starting to be part of that category a little bit, or very adjacent to it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, right? Like Opik doesn't generate code; it generates
Right.
prompts. But yeah, absolutely, and
Well, prompt is the code for this environment, right?
exactly, exactly. Yeah, that is the spec. So this is another thing that came from the community that it's like we're exploring now was like, and we released like an MCP server, but like the idea is like, okay, if I'm writing my Gen AI application in Cursor and that can generate my LangChain, LangGraph code really easily, but then I want to optimize the prompt, right? Like what does that experience look like? I think that's the future. But back to your original question, the coding assistants, the chat GPT, these are applications these enterprises are buying from someone else, right? But all of them are also trying to build their own stuff, whether it's user facing, customer facing, completely internal. They're all trying to build their own things. And you can think of, depending on the industry, like a million of examples of, where you can use Gen AI to provide more productivity. So that segment is like, I think, behind where most people think it is, right? And again, it's kind of goes back to the previous point. Like there's a lot of POCs, a lot of them, but very, very few of them actually made it to production. And the reality is like it's what happens is usually the same, right? There's like a team building that stuff, that POC, and they might work on it for a few weeks or a few months, and then they present it to like a business executive or a product manager, depending on the use case. And then it starts breaking in all these mysterious ways, and that person says, hey, this is not ready, right? And a lot of them are stuck there. It's like, okay, like, well, what, we wrote the code, we did the integration with the database, we did all this stuff, we're using the best library, but like, I don't know why it's not responding the right way, right? So that's really where most of these use cases are stuck. And again, the way to get from there to something that you can put in front of users is having that kind of closed loop of evaluation, benchmarking against it, and then seeing better results. And we're seeing with some of our customers that did adopt that. It's really night and day. Like maybe back kind of to your prediction point, there's no way we're going to sit here in 12 months and me needing to explain why evaluation is important, right? For Gen AI applications. There's just no way. It's like kind of like sitting here and saying why developers should write unit tests. In my opinion, it's like, very obvious. I think as more, companies adopt this paradigm and, hopefully Opik throughout their journey, like you're going to start seeing a lot more of these use cases. And I think you're going to start seeing specific segments or product segments that blow up similar to how these developer assistants did, right? Like, because obviously when they figured it out and whoever was first, it doesn't really matter, but there's so much value there, right? That you can see it from every perspective. I think, Cursor went from 0 to like 600 million in ARR in less than a year. I don't know. It's fast, like 6 times faster than the fastest one before that or something like that. So
I think ChatGPT still holds the record on
Chat,
that.
yeah, but that's
Yeah.
I call that
That's
like a
consumer. Yes, that's kind of
consumer
more the
application.
business.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're gonna start seeing more and more of these like product categories that are completely being disrupted or invented through like these Gen AI use cases, and you're gonna start seeing them internally with a lot of these enterprises too.
Okay, that's great. Switching gear a little bit, because one of the things that you've seen is kind of, what it means to scale a company, right? We mentioned the pandemic and it was kind of a critical time. You're hoping to raise an A round and everybody told you, we'll see you after the pandemic or something. And at that time you had maybe around 10 people and most of them were on site and in New York. And today you're well above 50 people. I don't know exactly how many, and you're a completely distributed company. Talk about what you as CEO and your co-founder and then kind of your management team, what did you have to change to scale that way and also to go from being completely in person to being completely remote? Talk a little bit about that journey, and I think that would be instructive and very interesting for a lot of founders.
I think generally speaking, kind of starting from the end, my lesson is more people doesn't necessarily mean, more output. In many cases, it's like the opposite. And we've made, plenty of mistakes throughout the way when we scaled up and so on. And like you said, like for us, it happened at the same time because we went fully remote during the pandemic. And then during that period from, mid 2020 till like mid 2021, we probably doubled or tripled in size, if not more, right? So the biggest thing is like who you bring on board. And not only that they're great people and that they're a cultural fit, but that they're also used to working in this modality, right? Of like being fully remote. And when we think about hiring, and this is probably the biggest advantage of being fully distributed, is like we can hire the best people in the world wherever they are. And it's really awesome because if I had to build the same team in New York or something, like it's really not possible, right? So I think like in San Francisco Bay Area, you could probably do it. But if you're not in the Bay Area, like I think remote is the only way to go because like you just have the access to talent is on a different level. And we have people in 15 different countries around the world today. I'm a big fan of remote work, but there's definitely downsides. Like I wouldn't say it's, all smooth sail. Like you have to overinvest in some things. Like, for example, we make sure that teams meet in person at least once a quarter. And this is, people from all over the world. So it's not like logistically simple to do. And then the entire company would try to meet at least once a year.
So speaking of scaling, another thing that we had, spent time earlier on talking about is like you, many founders and many of our portfolio company founders are engineers in their background. In your case, also a machine learning data scientist. That's great. In the first 2 years, you're primarily building your product and getting to that early traction. All of your product engineering jobs are coming handy. But then your job as CEO is like to build a business. It's not to build a product. It's to build a business using the product.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, it's like sales and marketing and customer success and customer support and God knows all of those things. And it's also, by the way, unique to the product that you've built, right? Talk about that journey and maybe a few things that you've learned. I remember us having conversation earlier on. Okay, Gideon, you have to start focusing on the product. You have to go figure out sales for God's sake. To the listeners, Gideon done a great job of doing that transition. But I'm sure it wasn't easy for you, right? It's kind of it's a different. You're managing different disciplines, different type of people. You measure what they do differently. So talk about maybe the transition you had to make as a CEO, kind of mentally, maybe not just the blocking and tackling, but more about just that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, first of all, I think, some of the greatest companies in the world were built by engineers. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a transition, right? I think the key thing is that like, none of this stuff, how to build a sales process or how to run a sales deal or, how to think about marketing programs and so on, none of that stuff by itself is hard. Like you can learn all these things very easily and everything is available online. And there's also a lot of common sense there. The pitfalls is like, I think at least was for me is like not knowing what what you don't know, right? Like I did not realize in the early days, again, saying it now, it sounds kind of funny, but like how important marketing is, right? I was focusing on building the best product and, they will come, right? So it's not like we didn't do marketing, but I didn't realize how important it is, until I saw a really shitty product get more traction than us, that I was like, but like, this doesn't make any sense. And then you speak to these people and it's like, oh yeah, your product is so much better, but I've never heard of you. So I think like not knowing what you don't know is the biggest pitfall. And the way to like address that is just mostly spending as much time as you can with other founders. Then what is hard after, let's say, you know what you kind of want to do, is like enabling other people who don't have that full product context, who don't know all the history of the company, helping like these hires be successful is much harder. You really have to start thinking about standardizing thing, right? And then the last part is like, how do you close that feedback loop? In the early days when you're doing product management and sales, like you go on a call, you hear feedback, you go back, you fix it, you improve it, you build it. It's like, it's actually really fun. But suddenly like other people are having these conversations and they hear the feedback and they don't necessarily know what's the best follow-up questions on it. So how do you build that system, that process where that knowledge gets back into the organization, you synthesize and you improve on it? And you see so many companies fail there just because you can see great products suddenly go sideways. So that is hard, and it's not like I have the solution. It's something we're constantly working on. But for me, that was the biggest transition or the biggest challenge there.
So Gideon, we're getting a little kind of closer to the end. Where do you see Comet in like 2-3 years?
I think, like every single person that's looking to build or building a Gen AI product, when they think about setting up and getting ready, like I think we'll be on that top of the list, right? Like that's the vision. And the way I think about it is like when you start a software project, the first thing you do is you init a Git repo or a GitHub repo. Like this is kind of what I envision for us. It's just going to be a no-brainer. This is part of what I need to do.
Great, great. Fantastic. Well, we'll wait and see, and we'll talk again in 2 years and see where you are. So let's do this kind of fun lightning round where I just ask, question and just give a short answer, whatever comes to mind. So if you text yourself a message on day one of Comet, what would it say?
Don't do it. Oh, I'm joking. I mean, probably half joking, but no, I mean, I don't regret it. But like when you walk into this, you have no idea what you're walking into. So
Right.
just hold tight.
Don't discourage yourself of 2018. Yeah.
No. There's so many discouragements around the way. So if this is what discouraged someone, they probably shouldn't do it anyway. But I'm just joking.
I think what you'd have said to yourself is remember why you're doing it, right?
Yeah.
Because there could be so much pain along the way, right? Okay, this one we kind of covered, but maybe now it's gonna. So, what's your hot take on AI today? Like in one sentence.
Gen AI applications do not improve with more data. That's for me is like mind blowing.
Good. Okay. If we were to do this again in a year, what will be the most important, kind of new thing that happened in AI?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but I think, again, this paradigm where there's like a static model and you're just calling it, and based on what it responds, you do a bunch of stuff, to me seems like not natural and like the wrong way. I think it needs to be something a lot more symbiotic.
So basically, you're saying Gen AI applications will be getting better as people use them. They'll get better. Is that kind of what you're implying?
That's part of it, but also like this contract between us and the LLM provider. I send you a bunch of text, you send me a bunch of text back, and then based on that, I decide what to do next. To me, seems like unnatural. It seems like we can build these models in a way that they live inside this graph of decisions versus just being on the other side of the kind of the chasm and just getting responses back and forth. I don't know exactly what it would look like, but if I had to guess, I think the future is like a lot more kind of integrated.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. What are you like watching or listening? Like maybe one podcast you're listening for, kind of professionally for what you're doing, and then either a podcast or a book you're reading that's not work related.
I'm not a huge work podcast fan just because I think the information density is quite low, but I do listen to the Formula One High Performance podcast because, there's a lot of similarities. It's an engineering sport, and they talk about how they have to keep inventing and squeeze as much from the engineering, but then you got obviously the competitive side and like the athlete mentality of how you wake up in the next morning and keep going. So that's one I really like. In terms of reading, like the book I always like recommend, it's kind of like a classic. It's like the 1 Minute Manager. We used to buy it to every new manager here at Comet. Maybe we should go back doing it. It's like very short. You could probably read it in like 30, 40 minutes. But for me, it was like very mind-opening after already managing people for a few years, like of just this, how you shift and how you think about making someone successful versus just working with a colleague. It's a little bit different.
Thank you, Gideon. This was great. Really enjoyed talking with you, and look forward maybe to doing it again in 12 months.
Yes, absolutely. And you should definitely hold me accountable for my predictions. I kept them pretty vague, so hopefully we can make them work. But yeah, this was a lot of fun. Yuval, thank you for having me, and thanks for obviously your guys' continued support. It's been fun building with the Trilogy team as well.
Great. Thank you.
That's a wrap on today's episode of Cloudbreak. To learn more about Comet, visit comet.com. If you're building something amazing and want to learn more about Trilogy Equity Partners, visit us at trilogyequity.com. If you liked what you heard today, subscribe, rate, review, and/or share this podcast with your friends. Until next time.